The presenting sponsor of the Canny Climate Dialogues podcast is the University of Auckland's International Office, and don't we love them for it? The University of Auckland's International Office, who were actually our guests on the most recent episodes, so make sure you check it out. They are proud to sponsor the Canny Climate Dialogues podcast series, and we hope to continue to make them proud. As you can imagine, New Zealand is a unique place to think about climate through the lens of their Indigenous cultures. And leading the world's universities in the Times Higher Ed Global Impact Ranking for the first 2 years of the ranking, as we all work towards the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, the international team at the University of Auckland share your concerns, dear listeners. That's right, your concerns are valid and real, and they share your concerns about climate action and international education. The University of Auckland is answering the world's call. Welcome to the Canny Climate Dialogues, the podcast at the intersection of international education and climate action. I'm CJ Tremblay, your host, and today is a gooder. Not only am I joined for the first time this season, for real, side by side on Zoom still, but still live, by Canny co-founder and the president of the board, Elsa Lamont, in the co-host hot seat. But we will be talking to authors of an article that made the rounds this summer. But before we get into that, a friendly reminder to you, our friend and listeners, to subscribe to the podcast feed wherever it is that you lend your ears to the Canny Climate Dialogues. And if you're one of our friends who listens on Apple Podcasts, let us know how you like the pod with a friendly rating, preferably all the stars, but I'm not the boss of you. Do what feels right. So subscribe and rate. Those are the two immediate actions you can take right now while listening to the podcast to continue your climate action and climate justice journeys, because we're super committed to making sure we provide you with great interviews and discussions to help you take action within your organization. Okay, now back to that article I was talking about. This article was honestly all over the Canny Slack workspace this summer. And it was and continues to be sent around in group chats. We refer to it all the time. We posted it on LinkedIn. Chances are you saw it, hopefully. The article was titled, "Why Sustainability Isn't Enough in International Education." And I feel like it encapsulates really perfectly the approach that we've been advocating for Canny, but we hadn't really found the right language to describe it properly. So a massive thank you to the authors for that. The article really talks about the very real problem we need to start working on at the highest levels of our sector, combined with the hopefulness and the positive opportunities when they introduce the concept of regenerativity. I definitely had to practice saying that a lot of times, but I've come around. So it was published in the University World News in June, and there was not a week that went by where I don't think about how Jenny and Ola, the authors, said out loud, or I guess in words, things that have been percolating, but that not that many people are saying out loud or talking about. So eventually, I just reached out to the authors completely randomly, took a shot in the dark, and can you believe it? They graciously, but also enthusiastically agreed to join us on the pod. So I couldn't be more excited to speak to Jenny Lee and Ola Lundemo from the University of Arizona. Very exciting. And interestingly, since the time where they published the article, it's become more relevant with the release of the UN IPCC report declaring a code red for humanity and the urgent need for action. And now, around the time we're releasing this, all eyes are on COP26 in Glasgow, which is really an event that will leave a mark on human history. And hopefully, in addition to this, dear listeners, you will be joining us or have joined us, depending on when you're listening to this, for the Canny COP26 Climate Action Week happening November 8th to November 12th. So be sure to register or check it out on YouTube, depending on when you're listening to this. What's really special for this event, actually, is that we're hosting the first ever Canny Leaders Forum. It's a super summit, if you will, where we're convening, from what we can tell for the first time, the peak bodies and key influencers. And we're getting them together to collaborate on this problem, or any problem for that matter. And so many regions are represented. And we also have all the biggest acronyms there: NAFSA, CBIE, AIE, EAIE, IEAA, UUKI. You come up with a combination of letters, and they are probably going to be at our Super Summit in the Leaders Forum. So we're going to be sharing the commitment of these organizations following the summit in our regional meetings. And so you don't want to miss those regional meetings. You don't want to miss Canny COP26 Climate Action Week. If you weren't able to attend and you're listening to this after November 12th, we understand things get busy. I hear you. We are going to be sharing it on YouTube. So we definitely want to hear from you, what you think. We understand you're busy people, but it's very, very exciting. And we look forward to seeing you on Zoom or on YouTube whenever it is that you are able to join us. All right. Now's the time. So let's welcome Ailsa.
Ailsa, welcome.
DJ, good morning.
Good morning, good afternoon. Okay, so it's so nice to have you back in the co-host chair on the pod. Welcome. You're settling in. How's it going?
I'm looking forward to the pod and the more hopeful message that is going to come out of it today.
Yeah, how excited are you for today?
I am really looking forward to this. It's not that I don't love, I love all of my children. I don't have favorites, but at the same time, I'm really excited about this one because I just love this whole notion of regenerativity. And the second I read that article, it was like, screaming lights going off. And I was like, this is it. This is the term I've been looking for.
Yeah. And we've talked about this article no less than 100 times. Like, we talk about this all the time, and it's a really big one. So today's really exciting. I'm so glad to have you for the full episode so we can do this interview together. It's going to be great. Thanks so much for being here. And just going to tell our listeners a little bit about Jenny and Ola.
Jenny Lee is a professor in the Center for the Study of Higher Education at the University of Arizona in the United States. Her international research covers how migration policies, geopolitics, and social forces shape inequities in higher education. Dr. Lee was a former Fulbright scholar to South Africa, where she then continued as a visiting scholar at the University of Cape Town for 8 years, and has very recently relocated to the US with her husband and now co-author, Ola Lundemo. Ola Lundemo is the Ecotourism Program Chair in the School of Natural Resources and the Environment at the University of Arizona. Ola has worked in the environmental sustainability sector for over 25 years in Norway, the Caribbean, and mostly in South Africa. He's also the founder of Shark Safaris, which is an ecotourism company focused on education while interacting with local wildlife. As part of his current position at the University of Arizona, he is developing a bachelor's degree program on ecotourism. Very cool. Let's welcome them to the pod.
Welcome, Jenny and Ola. Thank you so much for being here. We are so excited to have you on the podcast. So tell us and our audience, where are you guys joining from today?
So, hi everyone. It's just an honor to be part of this, and just thank you for the invitation. We are zooming in from our home in Tucson, Arizona. Same house, different rooms. And for those who are not familiar with Tucson itself, we're a city that's located in the southwest region of the country. We're about 100 kilometers north of the US-Mexico border. And for any foodies out there listening or watching, just a fun fact, our proximity to Mexico helped Tucson be the first US city to be designated a city of gastronomy by UNESCO for our Sonoran style Mexican food. So if anyone's in our area, hit us up. We're happy to make some recommendations.
That was not in my original plans, but it feels like it might be now. So noted. Hopefully that was not a should-vitation. I will take you up on that one day, I'm sure. So thank you. That's awesome. And now this next question is something that most of our listeners are familiar with. We ask this question to all of our guests, which is, tell us a little bit about what is your climate story?
So, well, my childhood was on a little island in the Caribbean called Curacao. And I started diving at 5 years old back in the 1970s. And that's a time when coral reefs were colorful, vibrant, and well, they were just plain healthy. And there was just so much fish. And through my thousands of dives around the world since then, many of them in tropical places where coral reefs, which are the main attraction for divers. And since then, I've witnessed firsthand how things have changed underwater, and especially corals, how they have seriously degraded from bleaching. And there's also fewer fish. So bleaching, for those who don't know, is what happens when the ocean's environment changes. If it gets too hot, the coral stresses out and expels the algae that lives in it. And as the algae leaves, the coral fades until it looks like it's been bleached. If the temperature stays high, then the coral won't let the algae back and the coral will die, leaving crisp white skeleton-looking remains. And this degradation that I've seen is faster than I ever expected in my lifetime. So this is obviously very disappointing when I go back to the same dive sites compared to what I can remember. And yeah, so this is happening in such a short time frame. Well, a relatively short time frame. And it's a time frame that we can actually perceive in a personal lifetime, not hundreds of years, but just decades. And apart from the sea, I've also noticed how every natural gem seems to be overpopulated by more and more people. And this is to the extent where you often have to walk in a queue to get somewhere, almost as if you're on your way to a big concert or a sports tournament. And this is just to take a hike on a mountain. So the attraction itself now turns itself into not as enjoyable for anyone any longer. And it obviously also has an impact, all the people in nature. So these kind of sites simply cannot keep up with the pressure of people constantly coming there because, sorry, of the increased travel. So each time I go back to a place, including my many on my many diving expeditions, we're now sharing that space with more and more people. And often there's fewer fish and more garbage left behind. And of course, tourists paying good money to see a pristine destination becomes disappointed too. So these direct experiences and observations are what drove my lifelong dedication to responsible tourism and conservation.
Wow. Yeah, that's a climate story.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you for sharing that with us. And Jenny, what is it for you? Yeah, what about you?
Yeah, well, my career is long focused on international higher education as a field, and I'm relatively new to these climate change conversations. So much of my thinking about it has actually been informed by Ulla. But as far as stories go, the most profound moment for me was in 2018. Ulla and I were residents. By the way, we're husband and wife, in case you're wondering, why do they keep talking about being together all the time? Yes, we were husband and wife. And so we were residents in Cape Town, South Africa at the time, and prior to relocating to Arizona earlier this year. And some of you may be familiar and heard about the story about Cape Town approaching day zero. And this is when our dams would run so dry that the taps would just stop providing any water. So during this time, during the Cape Town drought, we were restricted to as low as 50 liters per person. So if anyone is not sure of how little that is, that means very short showers, intermittent showers while you're in the shower, not washing our cars or watering the yard. If so, you would get a citation, a hefty fine, even limiting how many times we could flush the toilet. But even more than the limiting supply, there were just increasing fears about public health, potential violence. We were thinking every day when would be the right time to leave and where would we go. So thankfully, the rains eventually returned, but this direct experience has forever changed and will forever change how I appreciate fresh water. But also the complications regarding who has access to fresh water and the implications about every dimension of public services, safety. But the bigger lesson, I think, for me and for hopefully those of you who are listening, is that day zero was actually avoidable. The drought was, yes, partially or primarily attributable to global warming, but also how water was being managed and being resourced, meaning governmental responsiveness, public responsiveness. And it was actually quite impressive to see how the public consciousness in Cape Town quickly changed towards conservation as day zero was approaching. So that's my climate story.
Wow. Okay. Well, thank you so much for sharing that. And I think that is a good place to jump over to the article that you guys wrote and published. And I've talked about it in the introduction. It's made the rounds. We've referred to it a lot. It's really impactful. And in your climate stories, I can kind of start to see shades of what has shaped those perceptions and your backgrounds. But what is it that drove you to actually write it? And like, I'm so curious to hear about what made you put pen to paper or keyboard to the internet and like how it came to be.
Now to start, our collaboration is probably unlike most co-author papers because we're husband and wife. This piece actually evolved from our many breakfast conversations over cereals and avo toast talking about work. Now, I don't know about other academic couples, but we actually enjoy learning about each other's fields. So there was some interesting overlap because I'm a biologist and Jen is an international university educator. So we decided one day to write this piece.
I also want to add, and we want to acknowledge, there are considerable writings and research on sustainability and education. But at least my observation is that we oftentimes harp on the same old approach to sustainability and hardly much on the regenerativity side. But I think it was the COVID-19 pandemic, most of all, where we witnessed that the earth could actually change for the better and that regenerativity is possible. So on the side, Ula and I love to watch David Attenborough documentaries. You've probably seen them all about the planet and the blue planet and every version of that. But my personal favorite is the recent one that was released, I think, Apple TV very recently, but it's called The Year Earth Changed. And if you haven't watched it, do watch it, because what it showed us is what happened to the planet while most of the world was in COVID lockdown. And it was so inspiring to see. So in a sense, what we wanted to do was update the field with more current conceptions of what we learned from the pandemic.
Yeah, I 10 back up that recommendation. It was profound to see sort of the change there, and connecting it to the sector is amazing. And I know that there's been, response in our like group chats or link on LinkedIn or Slack channels when we talk about this, but I'm dying to know the response to the article, what kind of feedback you received from colleagues or the sector.
Honestly, we don't really know. We did receive numerous emails from readers thanking us for our work and some asking permissions to reprint in other publications. Oh, and as well as speaking or engagements such as yours. But we do hope that at the very least, we hope this creates a shift in thinking from sustainability towards regenerativity, which we will elaborate during this segment.
Yeah, I'm super keen to sort of unpack the article a little bit more with you, but you have seemed to have spawned a movement here. One of the guests on a previous episode and someone that we work with a lot at Canny, Daniel Ponce-Taylor, who's the chair of the NAFSA Sustainability SIG, recently launched a Regenerating Study Abroad blog. And I'm wondering what it is about this concept or why it's resonating so much within the sector.
Yeah, good question. As Ula mentioned, we don't know the audience, how far this went, who's forwarded to who's having these conversations. So I think much of this is unseen, but I do think there are many of us out there, Sister Daniel, the two of you, some of your viewers who have already been independently thinking about regenerativity. And thanks to this podcast and associated organizations to bring these ideas together. But why is it resonating? I think for regenerativity in particular, this is a message that the educational sector in particular needs to embrace, but more than any other sector has the capacity to implement. Because we tend to forget in international education, the educational part of international education. People like myself, we focus on, do research on, and try to push for, physical mobility, migration policies, making a case for internationalization, student outcomes, but there's still not enough on the actual learning that takes place. And so it's within this learning, in this case, learning about the environment and our relationship to the environment that can change the very nature of international education. So education is what moves us from sustainability to regenerativity, because regenerativity, more than sustainability, centers education and provides the education and learning as key solutions to improving these global conditions that we all share. So as we'll talk about, this is a far more empowering message.
I love that. And I know that Ailsa loves that. And I can feel her like just itching to get into it. So we are going to do just that. Thank you for the context around that article. But yeah, I know that we want to sort of get into it now.
Yeah, honestly, thank you so much. I'm so glad to have you guys on. Like CJ just said, behind the scenes here, you might not have seen the impact that this article has been having, but so many people have been talking about it. And I'm lucky in my kind of day jobs that I get to talk to a lot of international education practitioners about, different approaches to education and to their operations. And we've been talking a lot about sustainability. We've been talking a lot about harm reduction, but also how the climate crisis in particular is this opportunity to really reimagine the way that we approach our business and enhance it and make it better for the student experience and for education. But I didn't have a term to hang that on. And the second that I read your article, I was like, that's it. That's what I've been trying to say. And so I'm really, really grateful to you. And I've been using that term like multiple times since, and it's really resonated with audiences. And clearly we have got a sustainability problem in international education in the world. We've just had the really stark findings of the latest IPCC report, which of course came as no surprise to anyone who's been following the science, but at the same time, it's still confronting when it's put to you in that kind of condensed way. And you get right to the heart of that in your article, where you say that it's time that we declare a state of emergency, and you say we need to reset our relationship with nature. Could you talk a bit more about that? Elaborate on what you see as the problems currently or to date within international education?
Absolutely. And thanks for that question. I mean, we're preaching the choir when we talk about, we just cannot deny how much more urgent can urgent be, how much more of an emergency can an emergency look like. And I think more and more, we just obviously can't deny that climate change is taking place. Each of us needs to take more responsibility, especially when it comes to travel. But for those, particularly in amongst this group, the audience, in the practice of international education, what we want to do is more clearly link this to the role that we play in steering cross-border activities to cultivate student awareness and action. So in other words, during COVID, especially post-COVID, as borders open up, it would be absolutely irresponsible for us to carry on as business as usual, and especially an entrepreneurial approach in international education that caters to popular consumer demands for travel. We know that study abroad and international program brings in considerable revenue to university, but there are parts of the world that are especially fragile and vulnerable to mass tourism. So while the tourism industry must take note, and that's where a lot of this regeneration conversations are taking place, we need to be thinking about this in study abroad and international travel programming, that even within our university sector, this needs to change now or yesterday. So for instance, the UN World Tourism Organization recently reported that travel related to tourism, which tends to be long haul traveling, is a major source of greenhouse gas emissions. So among the recommendations from the UN, from this particular group, is that we need to better measure, we need to better disclose CO2 emissions. This also means within institutions as much as that is possible, and to engage in carbon removal. So those in international education should actually be part of these kinds of actions, should be held accountable to actively better rather than deplete our planet. So what we are hoping to do is bring in higher education into these conversations when we talk about tourism and the tourist sector and the greenhouse emissions that are being produced as a result.
Yeah, fabulous. Thanks so much for that, Jenny. And I'd like to now ask you a question, Ulla, and I think obviously it's fantastic, your two academic disciplines and minds coming together over the breakfast table. It's making me think we might have to bring on other married couples to onto the pods and kind of encourage them to see what germinates there. But so one of the things I really would like to delve into a little bit more now is this difference between sustainability and regenerativity. I mean, in the last few years, we have got to a point within international education where people have been talking a lot about sustainability. It's become a real buzzword, which is fabulous because before that, nobody was even talking about it very much at all. So we have had that progress. But I see, what you've coined here, this term of this concept of regenerativity in our field as being the kind of next step, the next evolution. But can you explain for all of us exactly how you see that difference? What is the main difference between sustainability and regenerativity generally, but especially in the context of global education?
Well, okay, if we look at it from a sustainability perspective, this can be thought of as consuming less and travel less. In turn, meaning less student mobility and less study abroad. And then substituting with more remote forms of international education, such as online education. Well, that is absolutely possible, but it's not realistic. So we can try to limit international travel, but it's very unlikely given this phenomenon of revenge travel that is happening globally, in addition to the need for university revenue to be generated. So if we can come to terms with the fact that there will be a surge in traveling, we must consider how to travel responsibly, which is where regenerativity comes in. Now, regenerativity is a different mindset in that we can actually do more in encouragement and promoting. So as we mentioned in our article, it's the difference between leaving the tree untouched or planting more trees in its very simplest form. Environmental goals then go beyond just conservation, but more toward improved natural environment, and as a result, a healthier planet. That's a more hopeful message as well as a more empowering message, because regenerativity means to do more, not less. We leave the place better than we found it.
So, Ola, you mentioned something there about revenge travel. And I know in a previous podcast, Ailsa had said that she just heard the term. And it, the idea that with, the need is, you mentioned it earlier in your climate story, the dwindling sort of health of the coral reefs. And, we all know that icebergs are melting. So, before they are irrevocably changed due to the climate crisis, that might actually worsen the situation. And so I'm wondering how you see that relating to international education.
Yeah, sure. Okay. So to start, revenge travel refers to the foreseen and current boom in travel happening after the extended lockdowns throughout the world. So last year, most of us canceled or we missed some vacations away from home. And understandably, we now want to make up for that. So many people are tired of being home, they're fully vaccinated and have been saving up cash and loyalty miles on the planes, and they're ready to go on a trip as soon as they can. Now, with the unused cash that's been piling up, they may now decide to go on a trip to a destination further away and spend more money. And this is exactly what happened in many national parks in the US this summer, where there has been record-breaking numbers of people this year. Hours of waiting in line in your cars, only to be turned away at the entrance if you didn't reserve in advance. And then if you did get inside a park, the queuing just continues. But what happens then is that the sudden surge in travel puts even greater pressure on nature and obviously has negative impacts as a result. As for international education, as borders open and students feel safer to travel, there will now no doubt be greater demand for international programs and study abroad. So this is a key time then for those in the field to really think responsibility.
Thank you for saying that. And I know Ailsa is also nodding, and we talk to international education practitioners all the time. And there's a huge piece of our identity being connected to being on the road and having been not able to travel or see. And I think in another podcast, this was related to as well, as how like some of our personal networks were outside of our country because of all of the travel that we did. And so leaning on people outside of the country is more challenging, and sort of focusing on like who is nearby. And it's so interesting, and sort of the privilege that comes from that. Being able to even have these global networks is certainly not something that's afforded to everyone, and it's a huge part of our identities. And so you're saying these things that a lot of people are struggling with in our sector. And so like, I really appreciate you saying that. And you know, a lot of what we've talked about on the podcast before, it really resonated in this article. We've talked a lot about climate justice and how this is connected to climate justice. Listeners of the pod know that this is really foundational to the work. And I love in the article when you said, and I'm going to quote you to you, international education can do far more than strive to uphold the status quo and ignore the environmental violence and injustice associated with settler colonialism. And I'd like to dig into that and its connection to regenerativity.
Right. So regenerativity and climate justice are inseparable. But first of all, I think we want to start by saying this concept of regenerativity as an idea is not new, and it would be wrong for the two of us or anyone out there to claim it without acknowledging that this is actually a timeless indigenous value. We didn't make this up, right? This has been long in existence. And that basic idea is that land and people are an inseparable ecosystem. So just a brief history on colonization. Settler colonialism, in contrast, has for centuries treated land as property. And the indigenous people who, originally of that land, have been viewed and treated as those to be conquered, separated, and essentially erased, still happening today. What regenerativity does is it acknowledges this massive degradation and consumption that colonization started, such as deforestation, depleting natural resources. But in the process, indigenous knowledge was also marginalized. So this idea of regenerativity is to address as much as possible and to undo these wrongs. So in the US, for example, there are already efforts underway to acknowledge Native peoples and indigenous knowledge in Western colonized locations as well. Outside the United States, we see this happening, Canada as well. We see this oftentimes in the form of land acknowledgements. you get an email from someone and in the bottom of their signature, it acknowledges that this university is residing on stolen native lands. They probably won't say stolen. They'll say we reside on native lands, but this is like an acknowledgement. And it's one thing to admit historical violence, but it's quite another to take those words even further. So this is where regenerativity comes in, because from a regenerativity or regeneration perspective, Indigenous people and cultures throughout the world are the local experts to teach the rest of us that we, including that we and the physical environment are interconnected, and that our relationship with nature must be balanced. It's a completely different orientation in flipping where knowledge lies. Whereas Indigenous knowledge, frameworks, theories, and views, languages have oftentimes been silenced. And now we're going back as the source of knowledge, right? So what climate justice means then is honoring the local and rural communities throughout the world, and particularly women who are oftentimes the worst affected by climate change, but are also experts when it comes to food security, natural resource management. So for instance, rural women do the bulk of the labor in gathering food and water, household resources, but in times of drought or climate change, they have to spend even more time and energy in travel and acquiring these scarce resources. So based on their experiences, for example, they have a lot to teach us, and ways that we can redirect our attention to those who know the land and have a closer relationship to the land than we do.
Great, that's fabulous. And I love that whole take on, getting away from some of the kind of very transactional approaches that have been applied within international education, and thinking more about the effects and the impact on other groups. So that kind of leads me on to the next question. And we've talked a lot about some of the key concepts in the article. So Ulla, I'd just like to ask you more about some of the actual examples that you cite within the article. So you give some examples of what a regenerative approach to international education might look like, or study abroad. And you cite examples, like a really very eclectic mix of examples, including, using local suppliers in country, to possibly even introducing a carbon tax, but also partnering with climate positive industries. I'd really love you to elaborate on some of those examples, but also to perhaps share whether or not they are ideas that you think should happen, like a twinkle in your eye, or are they actual examples of practice that you've come across?
Okay, so for those who haven't yet read our piece, some of the examples we offer are supporting locally owned businesses instead of global chain companies. We can also aim to support locations and institutions that are committed to fair income and ideally carbon negativity. We can even implement the carbon tax to reinvest funds to the local needs. So most of these examples come from the business sector, but at my university, for example, 288 solar panels were installed on top of my building here at the University of Arizona. And these will provide 15% of the building's yearly electrical use. Typically, when solar panels are installed, vegetation is first scraped away, but in this case, vegetation was put back in order to have a cooling effect on the solar panels, which then in turn works more efficiently. So I think these are the kinds of efforts universities should promote. So as for incorporating environmental education into the curricula, I am currently developing an ecotourism major as a way for students to apply the principles of sustainability, but also regenerativity. And this is in one of the fastest growing industries in the world, namely tourism. We also plan to offer this degree as a joint program with our partner universities throughout the world.
Okay, that's super cool. And just, all of those seem like really important initiatives. But from a student experience, right? So much, and all of our listeners are in this industry because we're deeply passionate about the transformational power of international education and that sort of experience abroad for students, and, you know, really focusing on prioritizing that. So what, you know, how would a regenerative, you know, study abroad program look different to a student than what they're experiencing now? What does that look like?
Well, I think it's important to first distinguish that Generation Z, which is the current age group in universities, they're born between mid to late 1990s or early 2000s. This group is the one that would be most interested in regenerativity. Previous research shows us that Gen Z is evolving as an environmentally conscious generation. And this is also the generation that is more conscious shoppers, prefer sustainable brands and products. And it's also the generation that are the most likely to make purchase decisions based on values and principles. For example, what their choices do to the environment when they spend their money. So businesses, on their hand, they certainly know about this and this age group. And companies are sure to let everyone know about their devotion to sustainability and low carbon footprint. And so for a student of this generation, regenerativity means more. It's a more immersive experience where they actively take part in contributing to the place they visit, and which will be left a better place after they have visited. So our hope is that these students would be more transformed in their long-term outlook and also how they live in the world.
That's wonderful. And I've been working with some study abroad, global education practitioners recently. And last week I was lucky enough to attend the Australian Learning Forum for global education practitioners, learning abroad practitioners. And it was fabulous. And the examples that we were hearing from so many different universities in this region really were already, I think, taking quite a regenerative approach, or at least aspects of it. And really, they had some very thoughtful examples of programming. But it was quite clear that that was within some of the universities, and other practitioners that were there were going, oh, I'm not quite, that sounds great, but how on earth would you even start with that? So I'm wondering if you can share your ideas and thoughts for, many of our listeners are study abroad practitioners. They might not have really started to engage fully with this, or they might want to and accept all the concepts, but not really know how to put that into practice. What tips would you give them? And are there any kind of particular skills or knowledge that you think people would need if you're working in a study abroad office to help you go down this path?
Yeah. So again, first of all, keeping in mind that this is a generation unlike previous generations that are already attuned to climate change, already more interested in being socially responsible. I think that's especially worth paying attention to. But again, what are the kinds of activities that are being offered to them? So it's one thing to visit a tourist trap in an English-speaking country, eat Western foods all day long, and buy imported goods, right? And I think there are a substantial portion of these study abroad experiences that still exist and are actually quite popular. And it's quite another to visit a local village, learn about an indigenous culture, and have a more unique experience that, as Ula mentioned, would have a far more lasting effect. But what does this require? This requires universities, first of all, to invest more in partnerships with local communities and supporting local industries. By invest, I don't just mean investment on the university side, although I will say that it does require some financial investment because you will need to learn more about other smaller organizations, locations, making these types of connections than a massive global supply, company to help make those kind of arrangements. But what I really mean by invest is also the investment in building trusting relationships abroad, especially communities that have been overrun, long neglected, that may be distrustful of this big or small institution wanting to come in and send hordes of students, right? So I think it's a delicate relationship, but one that we should especially pay attention to in honoring these partners. And I call them partners, not just sites, right? Because otherwise we could just easily repeat a form of settler colonialism and call it regenerativity as a form of fake advertising, right? So, not just regenerativity, meaning, we're going to a place that that is less trampled upon, or maybe we're going to try to, engage with some locals, but we mean a genuine sense where we really do honor their cultures, their boundaries, the relationships. But beyond that, even in terms of how we market, right? Like beyond flashy brochures, how can we help make the students see this study abroad experience is not just going to Western Europe for a week, which is very common and popular in the US, but how do we choose these destinations based on a connection to climate justice, as we talked about earlier? Another big thing is we need to better incorporate diversity. For too long, study abroad has wrongly been stereotyped as travel for the elites. We already know that in the United States, the biggest market of study abroad caters to white, wealthy students. I think predominantly female as well. And perhaps, we're not seeing enough diversity in those who study abroad because marginalized students of color don't see their heritage represented or valued in their own core curricula, or they're not advertised as these fantastic destinations. And so I think there's a lot of work to be done, not just in respect to the destinations and the partners abroad, but also who are those within our campuses that we are reaching out to, who are those that are being neglected from these kind of experiences, how can we bring them, and also pay attention to their cultures, right, and supporting their academic journeys, but also their connection to sustainability and regenerativity. Finally, once students are there, students across diverse backgrounds, again, how do we help them engage with local communities, learn from them, and identify ways that they can engage with local needs? So in essence, what we're calling for is a deeper experience. There's many strategies to go about this. I think service learning abroad is very promising. That is one way for students to incorporate reflection. Any kind of reflection, community service, and outreach, as long as it's in partnership with the international site, but as well as the people. But I think ultimately what we're calling for is just more consciousness raising about a more meaningful experience where, again, we connect land to people and to honor that relationship. And as visitors and as students, what can we learn from that?
That's so great. And but that does just prompt one new follow-up question. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this because it's something I know a lot of international educators have been grappling with. And it's this idea of the kind of inherent tension between trying to make study abroad and global education experiences more accessible. So very often to try and get beyond that elite or that kind of wealthy, privileged group that has traditionally accessed most international education or study abroad in any case, to make it more accessible, you need to offer short program options because generally, the less wealthy you are, the more likely you are to maybe be able to take up a short program compared to, let's say, a full semester or year abroad. And that kind of works a little bit against that idea of trying to make deeper experiences and deeper connection with place. So I know that some people are grappling with that. And sorry to spring that on you, but do you have any thoughts about ways to manage that kind of tension?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think a fair question, right? Because we want to have a deep experience. Does that mean then we have to go far away, which tends to be very expensive and then excludes a lot of people that will never have access to such an amazing opportunity, right? And so, for example, in Tucson, Arizona, we are surrounded by native reservations, right? This is an opportunity for students to have this culturally immersive experience not too far from where the university is located, but would probably normally not go. Obviously, that requires a trusting relationship between the tribe and the university to have this arrangement. We have alumni, we have staff, we have individuals in the senior leadership who are from the reservation. But once that relationship is built, this could be an amazing way for students to learn about another culture within driving distance. We even have service learning programs where they come back and forth and mentor. But this also can be a way to support local communities through services that we may be able to offer or programs that we may be able to provide in ways to support the needs of a local community. So yes, we can go visit an Indigenous community in Australia and pay $5,000 to $10,000, I don't know, quite thousands of dollars, or we can pay for half a tank of gas and learning about our own native community, right? So I think I want to dispel this idea that you have to go far to learn something new. I think sometimes the places that are very close to us, are probably either invisible or taken for granted or are seen as not exotic enough, right? And so I think it's also our responsibility to see how the world is actually a lot more interconnected than we think, and we can learn about Indigenous values just even, in a place that, that has been colonized, like not too far down the road, right? So I think that there are ways to go about it. But once we see those interconnections, and this is what I use to make a case for internationalization for people who are very national, US first minded, it actually benefits us to learn from what's happening abroad so that we can bring it back. But likewise, I think it goes both ways. So as we learn about other cultures, we're going to be able to identify similar cultures in our own backyard that we probably haven't paid attention to before.
That's fabulous. And it totally reminds me of a great anecdote that I heard last week from Professor Betty Liske. I don't know if you've come across her. She's a very distinguished researcher and academic in the field of international education from here in Australia. And she shared publicly at this forum that, in fact, she had never gone overseas until she was in her early 40s. But her grounding in internationalization was from working within the refugee communities here in Australia. And I thought, wasn't that just such a great example that, you can be internationalized and open to the world in so many different ways. And I suppose the pandemic has shown all of us and forced all of us down some of those paths. Thank you so much for that.
Oh, hi. I was just over here fangirling and listening. I was like, for anyone not just listening, and if you're watching on YouTube, you probably saw me just like, was like a human heart eye emoji over that entire exchange. I think that's something that we're all super passionate about. And I think for our listeners who are practitioners, I think there's some really practical takeaways and sort of, when you just like point someone's head in another direction, you're just like, what about this right over here in front of you? And you're like, those are things that sometimes we're looking so far away that sort of looking a little bit closer is something that is a good reminder to do. You shouldn't have to be reminded to look right down the road, but actually you kind of do when you're in the international education mindset. And so I think changing that mindset is a huge part of what we're looking to achieve at Canny. And I think changing that mindset was definitely something that you achieved and started the conversation around with your article. So I just wanted to say thank you so much for taking the time, for being here. I loved this whole conversation. And Elsa, did you have anything else you wanted to say?
No, other than that, I really hope this isn't the last time, and we'd love to look at it. We talked earlier about maybe doing something on regenerativity within the Canny COP26 Climate Action Week, and now I'm thinking that maybe something around regenerative study abroad and climate justice wrapped up together could just be an absolutely fabulous session.
Well, I just, I think there was a lot shared here. Maybe some of you will listen to it more than one time because we put put a lot of stuff out there on you all, but I think if your viewers and listeners can remember anything about regenerativity, we just want to emphasize it's not about doing less. I think oftentimes we think of sustainability as doing less, but we want to offer a message about doing more. So this is not a depressing message. I overheard once, what's the most depressing field in the world is conservation. It's not a depressing message. It's actually a hopeful one. And we want to encourage a shift for you all to be more thoughtful and intentional, not just using less plastic, staying home because the world is falling apart, but mindfully considering, what do we do with what we have? Where can we go instead? What do we do once we're there? And so these small choices, like which vendors we use, what we consume, where we stay, who we meet, these all have a far-reaching impact in supporting local communities. So it's what we do and learn over the lifetime. It's not about taking away resources, but if anything, we take knowledge, and then how do we reinvest that into our major, our profession, and our lifestyle?
That's a good note to end on.
Yeah, amazing. So, Ola, Jenny, thank you so much. It was such a privilege to get to speak with you and to have you on the podcast.
Thank you.
All right. Bye, everybody.
The Canny Climate Dialogues podcast is engineered by Diego Mendez, who is based in Vancouver. He edits these episodes together, making us look and sound super professional. And also, he uploads these episodes to wherever you listen or watch this podcast.